School of Education for their support of this forum, which is intended to bring educational issues kind of into a global conversation by connecting some of the things that we see happening here in the US with things happening elsewhere in the world. Really delighted to have a couple of our own AU students on this panel this semester for the first time, and to welcome our guests. I want to thank Dean Stacy Snelling, who's here, and Charlie Casconi, our former dean who've come back, who are supporting this initiative financially. I also want to give a shout out to a whole bunch of DCPS teachers who I know are here and who came. Thank you, including some of my own kids' classroom teachers. And I'm delighted to have you here and to have DCPS teachers in this conversation tonight. And I also know there are a bunch of AU undergrads who've just returned from Brazil, and we have all kinds of interest in different panelists who are here tonight. But I'm going to turn it over to Amelia Tseng, who's going to moderate, so she can take over the floor from now. Amelia is a faculty member in our International Training and Education program, and also is the director of the Bilingual Education program. She's a joint faculty member, and she's been here also for a couple of years, about the same amount of time that I have been here. And is an expert in a whole lot of things to do with language and children's outcomes in schools around language learning and bilingual learning, and has graciously offered to agree to moderate tonight, so I get to listen and be selfish in my absorption of what everyone's saying. So I'm going to turn it over to Amelia. Thank you, Amelia.
Thank you, Cynthia. Yeah. Now it's my turn to use my playground voice. Oh, great. Hello? Any good?
Yeah, great.
Better? Okay, great. And this is the mic for amplification, and this is the mic for the video?
Yeah, that's right.
So you need me to talk into both of these mics?
No, it's fine. We can just talk.
Okay, great. Okay, so then panelists, we now have an amplifying mic, so if you would prefer to sit, we can pass it down. If you would prefer to stand and pace and move around, you're welcome to do that as well. So again, thank you, Cynthia, for the introduction. Thank you all very much for coming tonight. This is very, very exciting. I'm very pleased to welcome you on behalf of the School of Education, on behalf of the ITEP program, to our panel. And as you know, the panelists have been asked to respond to two questions tonight. The first being, what do you think is the most pressing issue or challenge related to race in education based on your experiences and research? And the second being, what, if anything, do you think that universities ought to be doing to sort of the theoretical perspective, but also really to the practical implications of what do we need to be doing when we're training educators and people working in educational policy and students. And as a reminder, the Global Ed Forum is a forum for questioning and for pushing sort of the bounds of critical thinking. So it's a forum where people have been asked to reflect on what they think in future directions for the field, rather than reflecting perhaps specifically on a particular project that they wrote. So there's a variety of perspectives that we'll hear from today. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Darren Cambridge. He is the Senior Program Officer at the Academy for International Conflict Management and Peace Building with the U.S. Institute of Peace. He also spent many years working for Common Cause. He leads curriculum development and educational design. He's also a peace educator in residence and an adjunct professor here at American University, serves on the boards of Democracy Matters Institute and the Peace and Justice Studies Association, and is an AU graduate from our very own ITEP program, with an MA in International Training and Education and also a professional certificate in International Peace and Conflict Resolution. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I will get up. I didn't get enough exercise today, so I'll pace a little bit here. Try not to trip over wires. I just want to say first, thanks for inviting me to be a part of this. Really important conversation, and it's great to see all of your faces in the audience, that this many people showed up to engage in this conversation. So I want to look at this topic of race and education at kind of two different levels. First, I wanted to share some personal stories about what my experience was like growing up as a minority student of color in a majority white school. And actually, when I was invited to participate in this panel, it really forced me to go back and reflect on what that experience was like and what I learned from it. Oftentimes, these are things that I didn't really recognize were happening around me until I got a little bit older and was able to look at them with older eyes, if you will. And then I want to look at something at a state level that impacts how schools are funded or not funded, the types of resources that are available to students, their families, and the larger community that a school serves. So, a couple personal stories. I think it's important to look at this topic. There are many ways to look at this topic, but I think one way is to understand the role of race in education as a minority in a majority white school. That's one way in which race and education can influence and impact one another. Then there's also the question of a majority-minority school that's predominantly African American, predominantly Latino. And those can be very distinct experiences. And how we talk about race and education will differ based off of those two circumstances. Now, my personal circumstance was I was a minority in a majority white school, local school to the area. I won't say what it is, but a local school in the area. And upon reflection, I thought about a couple instances growing up where it was made very clear to me that I was a minority and I was treated differently or looked upon differently because I was a minority. And I'll just share maybe 3 of those stories. The first is, and it seemed minor at the time, but I was going to an assembly. I was in high school. I was maybe first year, second year, and we were walking into assembly, and I quoted Shakespeare because I was really into Shakespeare. And the principal of the school was behind me and said, "Oh, Darren, wow, did you just quote Shakespeare?" I said, "Yeah, I did." He's like, "Wow, that's amazing. I'm surprised that you knew that." And I was kind of flattered because I was like, oh, the principal just recognized me for just off the cuff, quoting Shakespeare. And I kind of took it as a compliment. And I went home and I wanted to brag to my parents about, hey, Mom, Dad, I was going to assembly and, I quoted Shakespeare, Macbeth. And, the principal came up and said that he was really surprised that I knew that. And my mom did not have a smile on her face at all. She had this just look of just, anger. And I was taken aback. So I was like, Mom, why are you upset? She ended up calling the school and complaining that I was singled out for knowing something that I'm supposed to know. I'm a student like any other student, and I'm into my studies just like any other student. Yet when I go out and demonstrate that I know something, the principal saw it as a surprise. So that was one of the first moments where I realized, okay, maybe I'm viewed a little bit differently by the principal of the school. So it seemed minor at the time, but it's something that I've thought about ever since then. Let's go to another level. I also had one teacher who I think wanted to play a certain role as an educator. And he wanted to be the enforcer of rules, whether it's tucking in your shirt, buttoning up your shirt, tying your tie a certain way, et cetera, et cetera. And I always felt like he had it out for me. And so I like to push his buttons. I mean, I'm in high school, so that's kind of what we do. And one afternoon, I think after lunch or something, someone threw some food at me. Not really a friend of mine, but someone who I played football with. And when people throw food at me, it's I think one of the most disrespectful things. So I got a little angry and I got up and I chased him out of the lunchroom. And I chased him into our senior lounge. And I pinned him down on the floor just to scare him a little bit. I wasn't punching him or kicking him or anything, just scare him a little bit. And before I knew it, this teacher came up from behind me, grabbed me, lifted me off of the student, roller skated me back to the wall, and pinned me up against the wall. And that was, I think, really one of the first times I felt like I was actually physically assaulted, and I was surprised that it was coming from a teacher of mine. I got very emotional immediately, and excuse my language, but I said, "Get your fucking hands off me," and I swatted them away, and I walked out in tears. And I think immediately at that point, the teacher knew that he had overstepped the line. But that was a moment where I felt, and there was lots of conversations with the administration and the teacher, that it's almost like he was waiting for that moment for this black student to act violently so that he could come in and save the student from my anger. And here's the last story, and the one that I think impacts me the most, and I actually haven't fully grappled with it yet or dealt with it yet. And it was during the college application process, and a friend of mine who I've been best friends with since kindergarten, we played soccer together, we grew up together, he's my best friend. We applied to a lot of the same colleges, and we both applied to a college small liberal arts college up in Vermont, and we both loved it. We both wanted to go there. I got in, and he didn't. And one day I had him and a group of my other friends over to my house for a barbecue, and we were talking about colleges and which ones we got into, and I was saying that, yeah, you know, I'm excited that I'm going to this college. And he kind of just looked at me and said, well, yeah, you only got it because you're black. And that has stung ever since then, because this is somebody I've known since I was 5 years old. And he equated my ability to get into school solely based on my race, or at least that's what he expressed vocally to me at that time. You know, needless to say, I was senior class president, I was a varsity athlete, I was, you know, not a straight A student, but I had good grades, I'd attended all these leadership retreats, but he kind of didn't even want to look and recognize any of those things about who I was and how that made me qualified to get into and attend this school. He was hurt that he didn't get in, but I did, and he said, basically felt the only reason is because you are a student of color. I've never said anything to him about that since then. You know, I was 17 years old at the time, 16, 17 years old at the time. And that still exists between him and me. I don't know if he remembers that or recognizes it, but that was, again, another moment in high school where I felt like I was viewed differently, treated differently, solely based on the color of my skin. Now that's my own personal experience, and I think, you know, we've experienced or witnessed these things at various levels. And again, I think those are examples of what it's like, or what impact can be, what impact it can have being a student of color in a majority white school. And that's nothing to say about the curriculum and what we were taught and all those things. I could go on that forever, but I won't do that now. The second thing I want to talk about is the role of, or the intersection of race and education at the state level. And as was mentioned in my introduction, I spent many years working for an organization called Common Cause. And if you're not familiar with Common Cause, it's a good government nonprofit organization that focuses on media ownership, voting rights, and money in politics. And I'm happy to say, or happy to see, that in this presidential election on both the Democratic side and the Republican side, folks are talking about the role of money in politics. But it's something I've been involved in and studying and organizing around for, you know, almost a decade at this point. And I think it plays a key role in how schools are funded or not funded, and the services that are provided or not provided, and how school systems are structured. So I want to do a quick exercise with all of you to reinforce what role money in politics plays in all elements of policy, but in this case, education. So first thing I want to do is, if you are 18 years or older, I'd like you to stand up. Okay, so as you all know, if you are 18 years of age or older and a citizen of the United States, you are eligible to vote, and you can choose to exercise that right to vote if you want to. Now, I would argue that in a participatory, healthy, robust democracy, that all people feel like and are inspired enough to actually exercise this right to vote because there is an issue or a candidate that brings them to the polling place to cast their vote. Now, the reality is that in the United States, in a good year on a presidential cycle, you have maybe 38 to 40% of the country that actually chooses to exercise their right to vote. So I'd like everybody on this side of the room to take a seat, because you represent the 60% of the American population, voting population, that chooses, for whatever reason, not to vote. Okay, so now there's the 40% remaining. And as I said, that's a 38 to 40% in a good presidential national election that actually goes out there and votes. But when we're looking at education, schools, education policy, we're really looking at the local and the state level. And also in a good year, in a local state election, you're looking at about 20% of the population. So I'd like everybody from here back to take a seat. So now we're left with about 20% of the population that is going to exercise their right to vote. But the candidates that you choose from, that this 20% choose from, go through something called a money primary, which are who are the people who are able to gather enough resources and money to actually launch a campaign. So we need to look at who's actually contributing money to these candidates. And 9 out of 10 races are won by the candidate who raises the most money. So we need to look at how many people contribute any amount of money to a presidential race or to an election campaign, and we're looking at about 4% of the American population. So I'd like everyone in those rows to sit down, and we've got you two remaining. So this is the percentage of the population that contributes any amount of money to an election campaign, determining who can run and try and get your vote. But the vast majority of money that elections are run on are the money comes from people who contribute $200 or more. So I'd like you to both sit down, and I'd like you to raise your right hand, just you, and I want you to put your pinky up in the air. This represents the 1/4% of the population that contributes $200 or more to elections, effectively determining who can run a competitive race to try and get your vote. Now, thank you very much. When our campaigns are financed and run this way, this means that as a candidate, you have to go out and get money from bigger donors, that 1/4%. And where do those people live? All campaigns know this. They live in certain zip codes that have a household income of a certain threshold. They don't want to waste their time going to neighborhoods where people can basically not contribute any money. And so I'll end by saying, and this is our own president, President Barack Obama, who said this, when he first ran for Congress, he had to get into this whole cycle. And he said, I realized that coming from being a community organizer to running for Congress, I found myself in circles, in living rooms, in cafes and restaurants with people who lived at a certain standard of living. Those were the people that I spent time having conversations with, learning about their needs, concerns, fears, etc. And I got that much more far removed from the vast majority of the other people in the population that I wanted to serve. And that is no more clear than when it comes to education and the needs, the interests of families and communities that are trying to have some type of reform in the educational system, but it's very difficult for their voices to be heard and considered and taken seriously and get it to that level where they get elected and have representatives that are able to push forward things that are of interest to them. So I'll leave it at that and hand it over to the next panelist.
Thank you so much for that really, really interesting talk. That was a lot of information packed in there. Very, very interesting and a really nice visual representation for us. So our next speaker is Jody Dixon. She is a graduate student here, again, in our very own ITEP program, and a native Jamaican who spent 5 years in Japan as a participant in the fantastic JET program, the Japan Exchange and Teaching Program. Her graduate research focuses on international public and private partnerships and international education innovation exchange between higher education institutions in the US and China.
You can get rid of the other one. You can get rid of that one. Again? Like, just remove it from there if you want.
I think it's just simple.
You don't need it.
It's just this. Okay, good evening, everyone. So I will, like Darren, be approaching this this topic from two levels. It's going to be a very personal experience. It's going to be driven by my very personal experiences, but I will also be talking a little bit about how the systemic issue of a harmoniously, ideologically raceless society that I grew up in, Jamaica, has really kind of structured the way or defined the way that I look at race. Okay, so to be honest, for preparing for this evening's forum, I had to sit for a long while to find a point in my life where race and racial distinctions became salient to me. And I was very conscious of race-related subordination or oppression very early out in my life, and so I had to really gather various segmented memories and kind of put them together to be able to reflect and put them together as a set to help me really figure out the specific patterns regarding the knowledge and the behaviors in education that I really value, especially as a graduate student who's about to graduate in about 2 months, and as a budding higher educational professional, just to think about how I assess and approach different issues related to my racial identity and my ethnicity. So this specific point for me was very, very recently. As Amelia mentioned, I went to Japan. I was on the jet program. I moved there in 2009. It was the first time that I was moving away from my home country, and also the very first time that for me, minority or being a minority was real. You know, I was only 2% of a population of 128 million people in Japan that was considered foreigners, meaning that you are a minority. But funnily, I did not perceive it that way. I did not see myself as a minority. Because coming from a very multicultural nation, my physical markers, my very physical racial distinct markers, was not what I recognized it as being a minority. It was the idea of being foreign that really bothered me because it started me at a point of very assumed inferiority. But I lived in a very rural Japanese town. I worked at a senior high school. There's a very large Brazilian population in my community, a growing Hafa or mixed population, and a lot of transnational Japanese. And so attitudes to racial differences was something that I dealt with on a daily basis. And in my classroom or in my workplace, it was in many cases laughed at or brushed off by teachers or other co-workers. But it became serious when I saw my Japanese American peer deal with very, very troublesome, very, very distinct and explicit interactions dealing with otherness. So it wasn't just something that was dealt with my students and brushed off as innocent racism anymore. And so these observations on a daily basis actually caused me to turn my sights to Jamaica, because I realized that there was something that was very similar in that the Japanese education space was very similar to Jamaica in that the pedagogical elements that are necessary for us or for teachers to encourage discourse around multiculturalism and just diversity was devoid completely. And so I really had to sit and think about how schools, this facet of socialization, was actually accountable for perpetuating racial contention. So I started looking at my own education system, and I'm a product of the Jamaican education system. Started at preschool, did my undergraduate studies there, and I've never questioned my education system because admittedly, it has served me well. And there's something that I learned before entering school. It's this phrase, out of many, one people. It's our Jamaican motto, and before two, I could utter this, out of many, one people. And if you've ever visited Jamaica, or if you plan to go there, I challenge you to look out your window when you leave the airport. It's probably the first thing you will see when you leave the airport, because I grew up with it as something that was printed on pencils, on early grade books. It's even on our money, out of many, one people. But what this phrase does, even though we're so ethnically diverse, is that it paints a picture of a very racially harmonious society. But the problem is that it does not achieve what it hopes. It has not achieved unification in our country. It has rather tended to strengthen the divide that exists among the races in Jamaica, because 92% of our population is what you would call Afro-Caribbean, and it's dependent on who is talking, because then sometimes we're just called ethnic blacks. But you will find that the majority of the population is still very subject to very entrenched and overt forms of racism, because we come from a very potent colonial legacy that links the idea of worth to our skin color. So considering all of this, the notion of our racial identity is rather complex, but it is a determinant in the lives of Jamaicans. And I don't know if you've ever met another Jamaican, if you've ever asked them, well, what are you, Indian? Like, where do you come from? You'll get a very, very aggressive reply, no, I'm Jamaican. I've done this a lot. I've found myself very guilty of doing this. But this pride, this idea of Jamaicanness, neglects to consider race. And what it's done instead, it's manifested in a very racially restrictive system. And this passivity to racial distinction at home has actually engendered a sense of colorblindness. And this is very disastrous because we all know that race has agency for social mobility. And Jamaica's class structure is primarily built on race. But because of this, the binary logic that links white and black to bad or good is rarely recognized, allowing it to kind of thrive untested in this perpetually raceless, neutral state. Now, our color-based classification, and I'm oversimplifying this, is white, brown, black. And it's, for the most part, directly correlated to upper class, middle class, and working class. What is most interesting, though, is that the white population in Jamaica is by proportion the smallest. So for us, white isn't actually a daily encounter, it's more of a concept, right? But you will see in schools the level of social insularity. Even though we would hope that schools could be neutral environments, you find that looking at public elementary schools and private elementary schools, the vast difference in racial distinctions. Now, like many other countries, the US, for example, the US, education is framed as the great equalizer, especially for us post-independence. However, colorism has largely obstructed the working class, and we are the majority. And so our education system has acted as a continuous system of exclusion because it has become a form of symbolic manipulation for promoting passivity to the racial issues that we have at home. I recall my experiences in high school. Love my high school very much. But something I remember a lot when I was reflecting before coming here tonight was that we were always reminded to be, proper decorum was so important. And I remember in talking to another Jamaican who is actually here, how we couldn't speak our Jamaican patois or language that was, it's so popular in media, it's so popular in our music, but I remember that there were people who were sent to the principal's office for speaking patois because it was banned and actually described as the speech form of the Jamaican poor, the black masses. And so speaking it meant that you could be punished. And so now looking back at it, I realized that there were many instances, and this went unchecked, it went unquestioned, and practiced daily and served to reinforce the rich-poor and the fair-dark divide. And I should say, however, that the school that I went to, had I been eligible to attend that school 10 years prior to actually attending it, I would not have been able to attend it. Because, one, the school would have had to select me, and secondly, my parents would have had to be able to afford the fees. And so Jamaica's education system has actually gone through a lot of reform very recently, not that old, but it has done so on the axes of color and class. And these reforms kind of are centered on allowing people to have free places in schools based on their merit. But the reason this is flawed is because you find that students who matriculate into these more academic schools in the island tend to be from environments such as private elementary schools, and so the racial distinctions are still being continued up until today. So it continues into secondary school. Okay, but nevertheless, education is a way up, and so no matter how discriminatory the system is, it's still the way up for us. But it's almost as if our people are suffering from this sort of historical amnesia, and you find that these schools, they really have not developed or evolved past our colonial times, because their practices are still so entrenched in the dominant narrative at home. But I find it very ironic, especially as I, in my fellow Jamaicans, come to American or to other universities in the area, I find that we are extremely vocal about seeking Black rights in other places in the diaspora. For example, here in the US. But I think I have to think about this as well, because it's either that for myself, I consider myself a global citizen, or it's the fact that I've been so socialized regarding this free race ideology that it's more my pushback at the worldviews here. Now, Roa has played a big part of how I was educated and formally socialized. And my transition from Japan to the US made me extremely sensitive about being Black, but still only on the terms of being Caribbean Black. And like myself, a lot of Jamaicans that have migrated to other countries, we have acknowledged the discourse around the white race supremacy, but it has caused many issues for us to understand it and to adjust to it. Okay? So there's something I just want to ask you to remember, is that society isn't a construction which has become racialized, or society is fundamentally racial. And in the case of Jamaica, the process of erasing our colonial framework has not solved the conflicts that emerged from this racialization. And so the main issue from my personal experience is that this issue has to be tackled at the systemic level. And so when considering these state of affairs, I thought about the fact that for this issue, it is so critical that we have the right questions. But when we ask the right questions, that we have a sense of the answers to them. And so the question that I posed to myself was that, this is home. And how can these racial issues be countered in a meaningful way when they're so pervasive? And I started to answer the question myself, because I think the biases and the behaviors that I mentioned earlier are perpetuated in such an unconscious and an unintentional way. And I think we will all agree that despite the pervasive nature, attitudes and behaviors can be changed. And I think this is where our universities play a very, very important role. This evening's forum represents a space that, we are here. We're providing individuals, all of us have the chance to, reflect and to have dialogue related to race and education in hopes of challenging the status quo, whether it be in Jamaica, whether it be in our workplaces, whether it be right here on campus. And I think this is the type of activity that needs to become normal between students and faculty or community and administrators. But I think the problem is that overall there's a general collective there's a general collective restraint when it comes to talking about race. And I think for us to move forward and tackle institutional racism, that we have to really move away from the race word being taboo. Okay? So tonight I challenge you to, listen to us, but reflect, deconstruct, learn, unlearn, so that we can continue these exercises, because there's nothing that can change without them. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jody, for sharing your personal experiences and comprehensive thoughts on reflecting on deconstructing race in several different contexts. Our next speaker is Dr. Amanda Lewis. She's the director for the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy and an associate professor in the Departments of African American Studies and Sociology at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Dr. Lewis holds her PhD in sociology from the University of Michigan, her master's in sociology from the University of Michigan. She also holds a master's in education from the University of California at Berkeley, and a bachelor's in educational studies from Brown University, and has studied urban education as well at the Bank Street Graduate School of Education. Her extensive research focuses on how race shapes educational opportunities and how our ideas about race are negotiated in everyday life. She's authored numerous peer-reviewed journal articles and 4 books on race and education, most recently, Despite the Best Intentions, Why Racial Inequality Persists in Good Schools, which was just published in 2015 and which she discussed earlier today at American University. Dr. Lewis.
Okay, so I was told to talk for 12 minutes, and you're gonna have to wave at me because I am using PowerPoint because otherwise I'll talk to you. So I wanted to start with a story today about a boy named Kenny who influenced my career in a lot of different ways. This is a story about when I was first student teaching in California many years ago. This is a boy I became very close to. He was bright, slightly mischievous. Seemed like all the kids that I got particularly close to had a little sparkle in their eye, always looked a little something. But he was an all-around lovely African-American child, and the story happened one day in class. It was a rainy day, it was after lunch. The kids had been stuck inside all day. They were all a little bit high energy. They were finishing an art project they'd been working on for a long time, and a series of kids asked to go to the bathroom. As is not unusual during post-lunch time when you're dealing with 8-year-olds. I have one now, I know all about it. So over the course of the hour, several white students asked to go to the bathroom, and they were allowed to go, while several black children, including Kenny, were told to wait. And an important detail in the story is that throughout this hour, the teacher, Miss Emerson, was somewhat distracted managing the temper of a child named Antoine, doing her best to keep the room and him under control. Antoine was a very sweet but slightly volatile African-American boy who had special education designation for his pretty serious emotional challenges, for which he received a range of support services. And at the moment, Miss Emerson was busy, she was distracted, she was moving the art project along, she was keeping Antoine calm. And again, after Gerald, the son of a university professor, returned from the bathroom, Gerald was white, Kenny asked to go to the bathroom again, and he was once again told no. And from about 10 feet away, I watched his startled response as he and his protestations of but was cut off, and he was sent back to his table. And particularly, I witnessed his surprise and indignation as he walked back to his table, clearly uncomfortable, right? This was an 8-year-old who really just had to be. And he glanced sideways at Gerald, his white classmate, and tears accumulated in the corner of his eyes as he tried not to cry. And he visibly, you could see, swallowed so hard his Adam's apple moved all the way from the tip of his chin down to the base of his neck. And in that one moment, as I thought about this incident for a long time afterwards, I still think about it today in a lot of ways, that the troubles of one black boy in that class, Antoine, became trouble for all of them. Miss Emerson was not deliberately intending to deny black children access to the bathroom, right? She was an award-winning teacher, best intentions, we can talk about all that. But she was busy managing the classroom moment to moment as teachers do, and it was hot and it was hectic, and she was just reacting unconsciously. But as I said, Kenny had to pee. If you want to know later how I handled it, I'll tell you, that's a simple story. But at that moment, that incident, and lots of incidents like that happened to me when I was student teaching, led me to go looking for research to help me read and understand how it was that race worked in the classroom, such that even teachers with really good intentions could play a part in outcomes that they weren't intending, but that were unjust still the same. And I couldn't find stuff to read that helped me make sense of what I was seeing, and therefore I have been doing what I've been doing for the last 25 years now. And what I've learned over the past 20 years of research and study at school captures some of the important takeaway points that I hope to convey. We'll see how many of them I actually get through. First is that I now understand that that story captures in part how discrimination works today. It is subtle, it is often unintentional, but it is consequential. I understand that these kinds of pervasive racial dynamics are also often hard to address because of how people make sense of race today, denying that they see color anymore, much less that it might impact how they treat others. I also understand that the claim that race is passé, that it's old news, does harm because it prevents us from understanding how it does matter, how our seeing color matters, and how it might lead us to act in ways that are actually contrary to our own values. How it might lead, for example, in this case, a well-respected teacher to tell an 8-year-old that he couldn't go to the bathroom. I also understand how all these moments add up, how such dynamics constrain opportunity and cause educational institutions to belie their missions. And I tell this story because I think if we want to understand why race matters, we need to have better understandings about racial dynamics at multiple levels. How do we make sense of what we see? I want to share with you one other piece of data, and I apologize to those of you who were at lunch today, or the talk at noon, because you're going to hear some of the same things. This is a quick capture. This is one of the questions that were put to us. How do we make sense of racial achievement gaps? This is just one piece of data that captures those gaps. And essentially when people refer to the racial achievement gap, they're talking about, we could look at national test scores, GPAs, a whole series of things. It's just one way of capturing a persistent difference that we have seen in these measures and these outcomes, right? It's educational outcomes for decades, okay? And the question is, for me, how do we make sense of this? This is a social fact in search of an explanation, okay? And how we understand race matters a lot for how we understand this. Okay, so part of what I want to argue when we think about both Kenny's experience and we think about things like the racial achievement gap, is that if we understand that we have to ask ourselves in a way that we don't often enough, what is race, right? It's something we take for granted and assume that we understand, but why is a student's race relevant at all for their educational outcomes? Why is black students' blackness and white students' whiteness? Why is Asianness? Why are any of these things relevant for educational outcomes? Hopefully this is something you all are well aware of, but race is not a biological or genetic category. There are no racial differences in capacity or ability. Survey data also tell us that achievement gaps aren't a result of differences in aspirations or family values. So let go of all the tiger mom theories that you have. That's not what's driving these. Okay? So then why does race matter? This question matters in many ways. Why does race have any connection to test scores? Race itself can't be the cause of achievement, right? It can't be the cause of good or bad SAT scores. It is a social and political category, and it is a category that has changed a great deal over time. Racial categories, their boundaries, which bodies are understood to belong to which category, hasn't been stable across time or space or geography. Okay? If those identified or racialized as black or Latino in any particular school are collectively performing in school differently than those identified or racialized as white, it is not because these groups are fundamentally different in some underlying way, right? There's something social going on there. There's some social doings that produce those differences. And I partly also want to, as other people have mentioned up here, ask us to always turn to history for a moment to examine the myriad consequences of racialization. What happened and happens to people once they're placed within particular categories, including the historic and current operation of racism and discrimination within the U.S. Okay? That historical process in which race became a fundamental organizing principle of our country. Racialization led not only to the formation of these cultural belief systems that suggest that some people were essentially different or better or worse than others, but also led to the development of complex hierarchies in which those racialized bodies were treated differently in social, legal, political, and economic terms. Okay, now I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because I already know I'm behind where I wanted to be. So when we think about how race matters and how history reverberates into the present, there are two big categories of things that we always need to be thinking about. One is how race functions as a cultural belief system. Race is one of those primary categories that psychologists talk about. When we look and see one another, we are always unconsciously categorizing each other in several ways, racially, along gender lines, different ways. But when we do that, that is not a neutral process. It carries with it a whole host of meanings that have consequences for the nature of our interactions. And consequences that often go beyond our, again, conscious thinking about it. They're just kind of things that happen without us having to even process it in that way. The other big piece of this is that all of the way that this is unfolded historically means there are major resource inequalities, economic, social, cultural, that obviously have big educational consequences. Okay? All right, I'm going to get to my conclusions right now. I'm going to run out of time. So the question that was put to us, part of our assignment, was to talk about what schools and universities should be doing about all this, right? So what is race, how does it matter for schools, and what should universities and schools be doing about this? Okay, and I think in many ways, the two kind of big points I want to hear is that universities and all of those of us in them need to be operating with a lot more intellectual honesty and courage when we talk about these things. So first of all, those of us who work in schools and universities need to acknowledge that the racial dynamics that we are discussing here today are part of our institutions. We aren't special. We often think universities or schools are special somehow in these ways. We aren't. Race shapes who we think does and doesn't belong on campus, shapes how we evaluate who will and won't make a good leader, shapes who does and doesn't have the credentials we want to see from those who try to join our communities, right? It matters at every moment. When we make decisions about policy, when we evaluate our daily practices and think through our organizational process, we need to do so within a frame that keeps in mind these multiple ways that race operates, the multiple levels on which it operates. Building on some work in health and medicine, I want to call for a movement towards what some of my colleagues have called structural competency. People have talked historically in schools about the need for cultural competency and understand the cultural variation of our students and that sort of thing. Well, I also believe we need to think about cultural competency. When we think about the composition of our schools, when we think about which of our schools have funding and which of our schools don't, when we think about which of our kids come to school struggling financially and which ones don't, we need to understand that in many ways this is the downstream consequence of a whole host of other kinds of both historical and present day policy decisions that have a huge impact on what is even possible within the schools that we operate in. Okay? We need to have that kind of structural understanding. Thank you. See, I knew I was almost out of time. Second, in the interest of, again, intellectual honesty, we need to play a bigger role in combating what some philosopher, Charles Mills, who I think offers lots of interesting insights here, combat the politics of forgetting. As one of the other panelists mentioned, we have a kind of general historical amnesia operating in public discourse today that suggests that history began yesterday and that we're all operating in a context of free and fair competition. This historical amnesia includes a kind of strategic ignorance about even recent racial history, people's assertions that racism is a thing of the past, that we don't see color, all those kinds of things. As I said at the beginning, those kinds of claims actually do harm. The last thing I want to say, I had several other metaphors, but I'll save them for Q&A. I think I'll slip one of them in at some point. So we need to combat these kind of dangerous tendencies towards colorblind ideology or post-racialism in general. If we want to get to a world where race matters less, we actually need to think about it much more and much more explicitly. And finally, we do have to resist a growing tendency towards racial apathy, towards a kind of distancing and disengagement from the suffering of others. There's a way in which people have talked about inequality today. Inequality once done to people now seems to just happen to them with none of us being particularly responsible. And that in itself is going to get us into a lot of trouble. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that very informative talk on theorizing race in education and looking at thinking at a structural level and a components level at some of the different factors historically and present that affect this and the experiences for our students. It is now my pleasure to welcome to the front, or to the mic I suppose, Luis Salazar, who is an undergraduate here at AU, about to graduate this year, a political science major with a concentration in gender, race, and politics, and a minor in public anthropology. Luis has worked in a number of local programs, including DC Reads and the Latin American Youth Center, as a tutor to at-risk youth who dropped out of high school. He currently volunteers at DC Doors, where he helps immigrant homeless women and families find transitional housing, and he is also interned with NASPA Foundation, the leading association for student affairs and higher education, and is on his way to law school soon, yes?
Right here.
Oh, fantastic. Congratulations. Luis.
Thank you very much. Glad to see so many faces here. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And I'm very happy to say I'm about to finish my undergraduate career. It's definitely something I've been working for a really long time. But something very interesting happened in college. And it was that I finally found out that I wasn't normal. Because I grew up in Miami, Florida. We got nice beaches, but we also have a lot of people that look like me. And throughout my childhood, throughout high school, I didn't really think about the fact that being Latino was different. I mean, I was Latino, it's my racial identity and whatnot. But I also thought about playing baseball, I thought about being a good student, son, a bunch of identities that now seem to matter a lot less in college. Now, being at a liberal arts institution, most of the classes that I've taken focus heavily on class discussions. So students are expected to read. They're also expected to unpack what they read and be able to explain that in class. And in that dialogue, that's where we learn. Now, if you speak from a place of understanding or trying to seek out the truth, the conversation may be very fruitful. But if you speak from a place of privilege, which is a term used a lot nowadays, it's very hard for you to learn. Very hard. So, one of the questions that I got when I was doing orientation when I first got here was, where are you from? I'm pretty sure many of you, I've never left this country, but many of you have. I'm pretty sure you get that question, where are you from, and you kindly answer. Now, when I answered that question, I was followed with another question. Where are you really from? And that really startled me because I can only be born in one place. So then I caught on to that line of questioning and I understood. You mean, where are my parents from? You know, why am I here? So yes, my parents are from Venezuela. They're immigrants. But I didn't come here because they're immigrants. I came here for the same reason you did. And so it was very troubling my freshman year. Matter of fact, didn't want to be here because I didn't have anybody to speak to about this. Because it's very difficult to explain something that's really happening in your head. Because no one is actually telling you you can't be here. Because 60 years ago, I might have not been allowed to be here. And I understand that. So I take the opportunity. I love the fact that I can be at the school. And so a lot of these microaggressions, which is another term being used, come in the form of, Louis, you're the smartest Latino I know. Wow, that's very similar to you. I went home and told my mom, like, oh, they think I'm really smart. But that word Latino, why? Smartest left-handed person, you know? And I have so many other things you could talk about. Why is it my Latino-ness? And I quickly started thinking about this because I'm in college and because I'm also trying to not only go on to law school and be the best lawyer I can be, but also learn about myself and learn about what skills do I have that I can bring to the table. And one of them is learning how to be okay with being uncomfortable. So what I want to speak about in these 10 minutes I have or so is the idea of normalization in class discussions, which I think is a very key component of the learning process. I've never learned much from just taking in information from a professor or a student. I've learned a lot from dialogue. But when your racial identity is being critiqued, discussed, investigated every day by other people, but you're not doing that, that causes a schism there. Why do other people care about me so much? Why do they care about something that I don't care about? Why do they care about something that has so little to do with how I got to where I am? And the distinction between what is normal and what is exotic. Or you're from Miami, so you speak Spanish. Could you speak some Spanish to me? I'm sorry, I'm not an animal at a zoo that's going to speak to you to entertain you. I'm not going to tell you about my parents in Venezuela because that, matter of fact, is very personal. It's something that I don't feel the need to ask you about. I don't ask you that. So what gives you the right to ask me that? And what I learned is, it's that sense that I can normalize my identity. Normalization is a manifestation of power. And power is at the basis of all human relations. And who has the power? Whoever can normalize. So, in a lot of discussions I also hear well, I can't talk about race. I'm white. I don't know about race. And I laughed at that, but you know what's funny? Nobody else did. Because everybody else thought, yeah, he's white. He probably doesn't know race. And being able to do that, being able to say, I'm okay, you're the one that we need to figure out where you fit in, that tells me I'm different, that tells me I don't belong. So, in this discussion, I want to think about not only what my personal experience has been, because I'm okay. Psychologically, I've made it out. I'm okay. I've dealt with these traumas because that's what they are. They become very personal traumas that then in the workforce lead to problems. But what I want to challenge everyone here to think about is how can we constantly force ourselves to be uncomfortable? Because there's groups of people regarding race who have had to be uncomfortable all their lives. And that was not a choice they made. That was a choice society made. I've always had the same skin color. Matter of fact, even darker, because I got more sun back then. But now, this is the most important thing. Now, I have 3 categories. I want to talk about students, faculty, and administrators. Because I want each and every one of you to leave with ideas of what can we really do. Because me getting up here telling you about my experiences does nothing for anyone here. For students, which I would probably have a better understanding of, I would say if you're a racial minority, whatever category that is, and you identify as having had to deal with something along the lines of what I have had to deal with, understand that being uncomfortable is not a disease, it's not your fault, it's not bad. You're a step ahead of everyone around you. Because in that moment of feeling uncomfortable, you're rewiring all those frameworks, all those nodes in your brain about what it is to be a certain race. What does that really mean? Allies, meaning anyone who does not feel this way, needs to challenge themselves and open themselves up. Be willing to challenge these things that you might have never thought about how being white has helped you in your life, but rest assured it has. Now, similar to my friend here, I've been told that I got into the school because of my race. You know what I did? Cool, thank you. They're not the admissions officer. They don't know, I don't know. The fact is, I'm here and I belong. And having to every day force yourself to believe that you belong is exhausting. It's exhausting because no one ever tells you that you belong. Because the people that you listen to are the people telling you these microaggressions. So when am I going to feel I belong? When I believe it. Now for faculty. Faculty have a very difficult job, especially when leading discussions. I would hate to lead discussions because there's a lot of opinions on campus and there's a lot of ways of thinking. So when you lead discussions, you have to take on that responsibility and think about whose perspective is this conversation being held? Are we focusing on certain groups while forgetting others? Are we validating certain experiences while unvalidating or invalidating others? We have a very big example being terrorist attacks which have occurred across the world. We show our support for some, not for all. People die every day, but we focus on some, not on others. Usually the ones that we feel represent us. Another thing I would say is that if you have 1 or 2 minority students in your class, please do not ask them to represent their racial category, because one of the worst feelings is having to misrepresent other people's experiences. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to do it because they need to speak about their experiences. To finish off, administrators, AU has done a tremendous job in these past 4 years of getting more students of color. One thing I would say is we need more faculty of color as well. Because in my school, School of Public Affairs, there's not one Latino faculty member. That might not seem like a problem, but it is when the men and women cleaning the toilets, taking out the trash look like me, but the people teaching me don't. That tells me, if I'm thinking about where do I belong, and I see that as a reality, it makes me think, huh, this is interesting, this is interesting. And the last thing I'll leave you with is, I urge you to, instead of thinking of safe spaces, of making everything safe for each group, let's all be uncomfortable. Let's all have to every day wake up and think, huh, I want to learn about that one thing I didn't think about, maybe my racial identity, because it doesn't affect me, but it affects people I care about. And my actions, you cannot be passive in this subject, because we're all in this. So I want to leave you with that thought. Let's all work together to be uncomfortable and fight every day to learn. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that inspiring talk on how to move this conversation forward, with thought-provoking suggestions for people, and for us in all levels of the school community, administration, faculty, mentoring and advising, students, and also talking about the role of dialogue. It's now my pleasure to introduce our last speaker of the evening, and after that we will be opening up the conversation for Q&A and discussion. Our last speaker is Dr. Graciela Moraes da Silva. Dr. Moraes da Silva is a professor of sociology at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and vice coordinator of the Interdisciplinary Center for Inequality Studies in Brazil. And starting in September 2016, she will be joining the Graduate Institute for International and Development Studies in Geneva, Switzerland, as an assistant professor of sociology and anthropology of development. She received her PhD in sociology from Harvard University, where her dissertation compared the experiences and perceptions of Black professionals in Brazil and South Africa, and has authored 2 books on race and discrimination in the US, Latin America, and Israel.
Hello, good night. I'll just stand in front of this because otherwise we're not going to see me. Thank you so much, Cynthia, for the invitation. Thank you for being here. I'll start with the video with a small caveat that speaking about being uncomfortable, I'm definitely out of my comfort zone. And I think usually as academics, you are always invited to present your own research. And Cynthia made really explicit that she didn't want me to present research results. So I didn't even prepare a PowerPoint. It's been years since I presented without a PowerPoint. So I'm actually doing everything I tell my students not to do, which is tell me your opinion. I usually tell them, go read, see what people have studied, see what all the research has said, and now I'm here just doing like everything I'm not supposed to do. So I just decided to cheat a little bit. So I'm going to start like very broadly. In 12 minutes, of course, I'm not going to be able to present you a whole lot of like research results and background on Brazil, but I will start a little bit with sort of showing you where I'm speaking from. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the race debate in Brazil. And then I will talk a little bit more about what are the current policies that Brazilian government is pursuing. There's been a lot of change. And then I will sort of jump a little bit on my personal opinion, join with some research results. So just to start briefly, I think I was just talking with Luis before the talk and was saying, well, but in Latin America, race is not as key as in the US. And I think that's usually the impression that people would get. And I always wonder where that impression comes from. And it came from a really institutionalized policy and image that has been sold somehow of Latin America to the world. But if we look back and we think about what's the history of Latin America, it's a history of brutal decimation of indigenous population, massive African slavery. I don't know if you're aware, but Brazil had 4 times more slaves than the United States. And still today it has a really large black population, although it changes a lot, sort of pointing to what Amanda said, that race is really a social construction, because how can we explain that like 50 years Brazil has oscillated between having 30 to now more than 50% of the population really identify as black. And Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery, only like in 1888. So it's been basically a little more than a century that we have abolished slavery. And somehow, in the beginning of the 20th century, Brazil started to be defined as a racial paradise, or as a racial democracy. That was really quick, right? Abolishing slavery. 50 years later, you become a racial paradise. UNESCO was funding studies to understand how the Brazil had done so well, how it could solve all its racial problems. And of course, when there started to be a lot of studies on it, people started to realize that the whole narrative about Brazil being a racial democracy was much more a narrative than an actual reality. So social sciences had this important impact in Brazil. I always say that I chose to be a sociologist partly because I thought that sociologists could make a difference. And in Brazil they actually did. So starting on the 50s, you start reading social science to have this debate, showing that yes, race was important, and yes, blacks were discriminated against, and yes, there were like a lot of issues going on. But then we had a military dictatorship that, like in Jamaica, as Jody said, they decided that that's not really a good issue to discuss. Let's just say we're a racial democracy and just keep with the discourse. So the military dictatorship in Brazil, which lasted from 64 to 88, really invested in that like strong narrative. We are just a racial democracy. We don't have a race problem. Yes, we have inequality. Yes, we have one of the highest inequality rates in the country, but that has nothing to do with race. So that was really the strong, the way Brazilians think about these issues. And it's interesting because differently from the US, when you think about inequality in Brazil, not necessarily you're thinking about race. So the link between inequality and race is actually a new one. So things started changing really fast, not so fast actually, but when you have the democratization in Brazil in 88 and you have the new constitution, then you start to have a new debate of racial inequalities. Basically the black movement, which had been organized, there's been black movement all along in Brazil, but when in the mid-70s, they start to be more politicized and start to organize social movements to pressure the government. So when the new constitution comes, they are really organized to pressure the state to include racial issues in the constitution, and they do it. And then they started to slowly pressure for policies. In 2003, and this, I go back to Darren's point about the importance of politics and who gets to politics to really make a change. We have a working party coming to the, actually before that we had a sociologist coming, becoming a president in 1994. And ironically, it was, not ironically, but it was a sociologist which had participated in that UNESCO project from the 1950s. So he knew, for the first time, he actually goes forward and say, Brazil has a race problem. But maybe he was more academic, so he didn't do much about it. So in 2003, when the Workers' Party actually come to power, there started to be a lot of policies coming, like being implemented. So we'll just speak, there are a lot of things going on, starting on the 2000s, but I'll speak about 3 of the main policies that are going on now to address racial inequalities in Brazil. The first one, which I'll talk the least, partially because I don't know so much about it, is the Colombo land rights. So that might seem to you very far away from education, but it's not really, because it's creating this whole not only redistribution of land, but also some types of new access to education to rural populations that were completely like out of the map for the Brazilian government. Really people who are really far away from cities and didn't have access to anything. So giving them rights as quilombos actually gives them access to a lot of rights that they've been denied historically. But as I said, I'm not going to talk so much about it. I will focus on two policies that are more directly related to education. The first one is the teaching of African and African Brazilian history in schools, which was a law that wasn't, the Constitution mentioned it and said it was really important to have an education that actually talked about all the history that of all the people who have formed Brazil, and not only European history. I always joke that I know everything about Greece and Europe, and sometimes I cannot even say what's the map of Latin America. Before I came to the US, I had to do a quiz for a friend of mine who was a grad student who asked me to like fill where are all the rivers and countries and cities in Latin America, and I could not fill it. But I could know all the countries in Europe because somehow like we are taught always the history is like the origin of our civilization is European, so we are taught to think about it. So the idea of history of African and Afro-Brazilian history is to really understand a history that's not sort of the dominant history of that is the canonical history still today in Brazil and Portugal. So the second type of policy that has been the one that has received the most attention is affirmative action in access to universities. I don't know how many of you have heard about it, but Brazil really implemented, starting in 2003 in state universities, but since 2012 in all federal universities, which are the most prestigious in the country, the hardest to get, and free of tuition, they started to implement racial quotas. And it's really like racial quotas. They have a certain percentage of black students, now more and more joined with socioeconomic status. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But they have to get those students. And it's funny because they always say that we are importing this from the US. And they are not aware that this has been illegal here since 1976. But for the critics of this policy, they are always saying, oh, we are importing policies that were made for the American complex and bringing it to Brazil. Not acknowledging that like we basically have excluded all the students from public and federal money all those years. So okay, so thinking about now getting more sort of what are the criticisms and what are my opinions about those policies, and I will talk a little bit about the teaching of African and African American history, a lot based on some graduate students who have been doing work on that. I have some 2 graduate students doing field work on that. And more about racial quotas, being a university professor who have been in university since it started implementing, he's been implementing racial quotas. So when I think about the teaching of African and African Brazilian history, I think first, as of course my frame already put it, I think it's a great idea, and I think we need an alternative way to think about history. But what I see when I go to fieldwork is that it also creates a lot of new stereotypes. And the fact that teachers were not, we are changing this in the law and forcing teachers to think about this at schools, but maybe at colleges they are not really learning how to do it. So basically what they are getting to the students, it's creating new stereotypes about what African history is. So when I look at the field notes of my students, they are they're talking a lot about inequality in Africa. So in that sense, students are getting this really strongly stereotyped as Africa is the poor continent, abandoned by everyone. Nothing goes right in Africa. There are these really strong notes of students saying, oh, thank God we are in Latin America, we're not in the US or Europe, but thank God we're not in Africa. So in that sense, instead of really creating that idea that Africa is sort of there is some connection, it's really creating that distance. And in addition to that, it's putting a lot of black students in this position that history and that situation is theirs. So in that sense, the connection between African history and Afro-Brazilian history, it's almost creating this continuity as if it's the same thing. And in that sense, it's creating this feeling that, okay, so you're not Brazilian anymore. Because I am a white Brazilian, I'm supposed to be connected to the Italian history, to the Greek history, to whatever. While you as a black Brazilian, your history said African history. And join that with the whole negative stereotype that is going on, that creates a really dangerous type of thing. So really teaching the teachers to think about innovative ways to think about that history and really getting to know more positive or even like complex narratives about Africa, I think it's key. So I only have 2 minutes, so I'll just jump to the racial quotas. And I think my first thing to say, I think it has been a really successful policy. So basically, racial quotas I've been in the university since 2010, and the change in racial profile of the classroom and the change in the university has been amazing. And because it's so selective, even with racial quotas, the whole thing about bringing students who are not prepared, that's not happening. Like I still have great students and they are doing really well in the classroom. But the fact that the policy thinks about selection and not really about what's going on in the classroom might create what Luis was saying. So basically, we are bringing all those students, but we are not talking about race. And a lot of professors have some negative views about affirmative action. Let's not be naive. Some of the professors don't like the policy and they're scared of losing the university is going to lose its prestige. But we're not talking about that. And a lot of the students feel that they are getting in, they have all this new profile, and nobody's really paying attention to them because they have to be as the old students were. And anything different that they act, and anything that they try to bring from their background, they are not finding any space in the university to actually bring. So it's almost like we're creating social inclusion without diversity. But on the other hand, I think like one of the questions that if you have ideas I'd love to hear is how to think about diversity without also creating stereotypes. Because in Brazil also, the cultural boundaries between black and white students, in that sense it is very different from the US. They don't speak a different language, they don't listen to a different type of music, they don't read different books. The sociability is in that sense much more fluid. So when you try to talk about diversity, some of my colleagues, I sense, end up forcing black students to be the example of their ethnic group. So in that sense, if you're black, you have to like African American, Brazilian religions. You have to act in a certain way. You have to be interested in race relations, for example. But no, you might be a black student in sociology and you want to study, I don't know, economics, development, nothing to do with race. So how to create a debate without forcing people to essentialize in certain categories. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists for that really, really vibrant and interesting discussion. Looking at the intersection of race in education at different levels, at local levels, national levels, regional levels, international levels, the personal level, on the institutional level, in a number of different contexts was very, very revealing. So thinking a little bit, it's part of our role of moderators to think a little bit about some of the themes that connect these talks. Some of the themes that I noticed, some questions that are raised, and then to open the floor to questions, comments, and discussion from all of you who we're so happy to have here with us tonight. So speaking a little bit about themes that I saw connecting the work, there are a lot of very interesting questions raised that can really move us forward theoretically and also in terms of application and practice. One question, of course, is what is race? That's something we've been interrogating in our lives and in research for many, many years, but it's still a question. What is race and how is it relevant to education, past, present, and future? How do race and education interact on these different levels that I mentioned? The individual level, the broader level, etc. And one thing that was raised is that these questions of race and education, of course, are not isolated, but they relate to history. They're deeply embedded in the social context that we inhabit, and are developing in new discussions in the present day. and intersect with other factors such as socioeconomics, politics, and finance, questions of language and cultural discrimination, and ideologies of inclusion, of diversity, and of nation building. What does it mean to be part of a community practically, culturally, in terms of behavior, language, what you look like, how you act? What does it mean to be part of a cultural group, and how can we, as people working in education, address these questions of diversity without forcing others to represent an entire ethnic group, right? Without stereotyping, but at the same time while recognizing difference and opening the floor to dialogues where we can all move forward. Among some of the other important questions raised tonight were questions of normalization and power, of markedness and exoticization, and of the question of the self and other relationship, right? Who am I? Who are you? And who gets to decide who's me and who's the other person that we're going to look at and see how we can handle them or resolve them in a teaching situation. Another question was agency, group agency, individual agency, and institutional agency, and the question of responsibility, right, from moment to moment, but also on a broader level. You know, whose job is it? It's everyone's job, but in what role? Every single moment. You know, how do you take that up? Of course, there were relationships with mechanisms of power, and one thing I found very interesting was this idea of literal and less tangible gatekeeping, which is enacted and reproduced through our educational institutions, right? So many of the talks looked at the very tangible barriers that students of diverse backgrounds can face entering into a mainstream education system in different countries, for example, right? But what about the intangible ones, that sense of who belongs and who doesn't belong, and where that almost invisible sense, that invisible knowledge comes from? Because that's a tangible, that's something that's just as real, even though we can't touch it or feel it necessarily. And then finally, to sort of broaden it, the speakers also asked and offered solutions for what kinds of steps we can take, what kind of steps can and should be taken within institutions of higher education. You know, how can we open this up for different experiences? And what are the different things we can do in the different roles as teachers, as mentors, as administrators, and also as students and as parents, you know, as a whole community. So, with that in mind, which is a lot of information because this is a very, very informative and thought-provoking panel, we now open the floor for your own questions and comments for the panelists. If you have a question, please raise your hand. I will look around the room and help distribute the questions, and we have an extra microphone that will be brought to you so that everyone can hear your question. Are you ready with your mic running? Sure. Okay.
Hi, panelists. Thank you very much for being here. Really great to hear what you have to say. I have a feeling that a lot of the people in this room have interacted with someone else from another country, whether in this country or in another country. And I'm guessing that people have also encountered a moment when interacting with a person from another country where they say something that is racially offensive, and if you would choose to address it, you don't know how to explain to them why it's racially offensive. And I think Professor Silva's points are great to highlight that racialized systems and structures are different in every country, politically and socially. And so when you come to those situations, how can you talk about race in a meaningful way? You know, having some awareness of our own racial structures here in the US, but not necessarily knowing what the racial structures are of this other person's country.
Is there a particular panelist that you'd like to direct the question to, or is this an open panel question? Okay. Would anybody like to begin?
Does everyone see me or should I stand up? In the back? Democracy, free choice. What do you guys prefer? Stand up? Yeah? Okay. That's a great question. It's always very difficult to bring people into the conversation who don't think they need to be in the conversation. When people say something racially offensive, oftentimes they don't know or they don't care that it's racially offensive. So if you're ever in that situation, you should find something that, maybe a commonality. I'm hoping that in this case it's not someone in the middle of the street who said something, you know, in that case I don't think you have much of a chance. But if it is a friend, quote unquote, what commonality do you have with that person? Also, depending on what it was, do you think that person is even willing to listen to you or to change their frame of mind, maybe even a little bit? If you can't answer yes to that question, I would say just let it go, because it would hurt you more to think about it or to even respond to that if they're not willing to do anything about that in the first case. Now, if you do see that that person may be willing, they misspoke, you know their intentions probably weren't to offend you, that tends to be what happens most of the time. It's unconscious, subconscious. People don't understand the gravity of their words. In that case, help them understand through simple conversation. And this is going to have to be every day. There's no solution I'm going to offer you, at least I don't know of one, that's going to magically make somebody not offend you ever again. But you can give them, maybe if someone were to say, I don't know, you're really smart for Latino, or you could be a Rose Garden gardener, like I was told. Maybe that's really offensive, but maybe you could say, no, I'm going to be a lawyer, so I don't have to be the Rose Garden gardener. And maybe get them to understand that your position is not one of inferiority, and you're bringing up race because it matters to everyone, not just to you. And so you need to bring that person into the conversation.
I'm just thinking more, I think epistemologically maybe. I think forums like this are really important exactly for what you said. Like they really force people to understand that race is a social construction. So in that sense, when you are interacting with other people that are not from here, and you are forced to understand that their racial conceptions and assumptions are not the same as yours, it really forces you to question your own assumptions about race. So in that sense, it's really good that I think race more and more is being forced to be a transnational category due to all the transnational movements, migrations, and everything. So to really, and I think in that sense, the US is in a really powerful position. And if you talk to everyone that studies race in a comparative perspective, people always reference to the US. But the US is very rare to reference other countries. I'm now in a project comparing 160 interviews with African Americans and 160 interviews with Black Brazilians. Black Brazilians all the time reference the US and South Africa and a few other places, but the US never, Black African Americans never reference other countries. So in that sense, I think that says a lot about how essentialized in a way the conception of race in the US is, because it's really important. I think even in academia we don't do that enough.
So I agree that forums like this are really important to sort of push back this notion of colorlessness. Anyway, I was wondering, so we're at the higher education level, right? So at what point, I guess your opinion, should these sort of forums or dialogues be happening in like K through 12 or earlier, so as to sort of like maybe better prepared minority students, or maybe open that dialogue before a student reaches higher education? Just your thoughts, anyone?
Really, really good question. I want to touch on that last one real quick, because I'm imagining you or myself in a situation where somebody says something that's racially insensitive or whatever, is perpetuating a stereotype, and you're kind of like, oh wow, that stings, and they probably shouldn't go around saying that or making that assumption. You know, you don't want to get people on the defensive. That isn't always the best option. So I think a simple kind of question back would be, oh, you know, where, like, why do you say that? Or where's that coming from? Because that might just be the question that they've been waiting to be asked to understand. Oh, it's not really based off of anything other than what I saw in some movies, or you know, what I read in a magazine, but not really based off of personal interaction. Or if it is based off personal interaction, very minimal personal interaction. So I think helping people come to their own realization that they're perpetuating a negative stereotype, around those questions like, oh, that's interesting, where's that coming from? Or interesting, why do you say that? And to hear from them. On your question, look, I deal with this on a daily basis with my daughter. She's she's almost 4. She'll be 4 at the end of March. And she recently, on Martin Luther King Day, went into school and they taught about Martin Luther King and what he stood for. And I love her school, but I was very fascinated to hear how they taught about that. Because she is one of the few students of color in that school. And so I'm like, okay, how do you teach 4-year-olds about Dr. King in an authentic way? And I truly believe that young people can grasp, like 3 and 4, can really grasp ideas. And I think the earlier you reach them with these ideas, the better. So she came back and she knows who Dr. King is. She can identify him, whether it's a picture or the monument or whatever, she'll say. And I said, oh, well, what did you talk about at school today? And they said, oh, we talked about Dr. King. And, Miss Tracy and Miss Christie said that, if those students were allowed to go outside and play, but these students weren't allowed to go outside and play, that's not right, that's not fair. And Dr. King was like against that. And I was like, okay, pretty good, pretty good. But it does leave out the question of race, which is like fundamental to much of what he stood for. Now, the other interesting thing to grapple with that is there's an innocence that children have. And actually, oddly enough, the same friend who I talked about earlier has a younger brother. And one of my favorite stories from his family is that in kindergarten, he came home, his younger brother's name is Jonathan, came home from kindergarten and was very upset. And his mom asked him, Jonathan, what's wrong? And he said, I'm upset, there's another Jonathan in my class. I can't believe that the school would do this. They're going to get us mixed up, and the teacher's not going to be able to tell us apart because both of our names are Jonathan. So the parents initially were like, oh, he's upset, and whatever. They go to the first parents' day, and they meet Jonathan and Jonathan's parents, and Jonathan's black. And, my friend's little brother, that wasn't something that he saw as being distinct, it was the name that was causing confusion. So I think there's a level of innocence that we want children to hold on to, but I firmly believe as a parent, but I'm not going to, lecture to other parents, I think it's better to have those conversations so that when those instances do happen and they are exposed to that, whether it's in a cartoon or in a toy store or, on the playground, that they've had, I don't want to use the safe space because I think your point on creating a safe space is a really, really important one, but they've been able to talk about that in a container that is supported by a loving and concerning another person, whether it's a friend or a parent. And yeah, it can be a very difficult and uncomfortable conversation, but it's still a container that is supported. So I think to just answer your question in brief, I think young kids can and should grapple with some of these questions because they're inevitably going to face it. And I think the younger you can incorporate these ideas of diversity is power, and diversity is beautiful, and we can think differently, we can operate differently, and diversity manifests itself in a variety of different ways, not just skin color, I think is important.
Thank you. We have 2 questions, so let's go here and then there.
Hello, I work with DC Public Schools, and I do community engagement with their Office of Family and Public Engagement. And at our central office, we do a lot of internal work within our staff on race and equity. So just going to the comment of the young lady before me, I think that in a broader sense, beyond what parents share with their students, with their kids about race, I think it is the job of us as a society and as a public education system to have these sort of conversations at every level, because while children are very innocent, they are also extremely intelligent and absorb everything around them like a sponge. I know that's a cliche that people use, but it is true. When you have very young children, they see how adults interact or don't interact with each other. The offhand comment that you will make that you think goes above their head plants the seed in their head. And it reminds me of one of our leaders in DCPS. He is a white man. He's Jewish, and he's very progressive. He's actually the person who spearheaded this movement to have these equity and race talks. And he tells us the story of his little one who is maybe under 5 years old, and they were out somewhere, and the son asked him, like, well, what color are we? And the father, you know, being a former teacher and educator, he was like, well, what color do you think we are? And this child's response was, well, we're regular. This coming from a very progressive household that embraces diversity, that has and goes to a school that's diverse and is surrounded by diverse people. But at that young age, a white child is able to say, I am the default, I am the normalization, and everything else is not regular.
Was there a specific question you wanted to
No,
ask?
I just wanted to share that because I really think that it's great that at this level you're having this discussion, but I also feel as higher ed professionals, this needs to go on across the board. And whether that means that you as faculty are able to share your expertise with the local schools or with other areas that you might interact with, I think it's great to have it in a contained space, but as Mr. Salazar said, you have to make people uncomfortable and you have to force the conversation, period.
Well, we're certainly always very happy to come and talk to schools and make a few waves. And hopefully everybody will also be comfortable and grow. So we're very happy to do that, in the various programs we have here. Since some of the panelists talked about this specifically, I'd like to pass the mic.
I just want to, I think one of the important things about what people have been talking about, especially when you think about young kids, is that they're trying to make meaning of the world in a context of deep positional inequality, right? So, my husband's African American, my daughter is strongly identifies as a brown girl, and she's constantly making observations about this kind of thing in the world. And one of the things that she said when she was 6 years old, we were walking down the street, and there was a gentleman near a university, kind of, cleaning up the edges of campus, and she kind of muttered to herself, not even to me, she said, finally, a white garbage man. And part of it was like seeing in the world. So I think one of the things that I do work with schools a lot, work with teachers a lot, one of the challenges for us is to help kids understand the things that they're observing in the world, because often adults are really uncomfortable about talking about it. And it's totally developmentally appropriate for kids to make all kinds of observations of the world. And some of them had to do with them, and race is complicated. Half the time they're commenting on the actual color of their skin, right? They're trying to figure out colors, and so they're literally trying to figure out which color their skin are. Half the time they're talking about political categories of race, right? That have, so when people talk about being white or black, we're not talking literally, we're talking metaphorically, we're talking politically. So there's all these different levels that we as adults have to help kids learn to navigate and make meaning of and context, ways that are developmentally appropriate, all those things. But it's partly, again, requires us as adults to wade through the territory that we don't always feel comfortable with, and that we might make mistakes. And that is, kids are willing to make those mistakes, and they're going to make them on each other all the time. And so we as adults have to be prepared to respond. And in every school I've been in, incidents happen all the time, and they only have lasting impact when the adults refuse to confront them. When adults confront them responsibly, in an engaged way, help people understand what our values are, how to make sense of these things, then we all learn from it. But when adults try to ignore it, avoid it, then it has all kinds of really negative reverberations and can serve as a kind of trauma long term for kids. So it's really, again, important for us as adults to think about how to do that.
Hello, my name is Sarah Paxton. I'm a second-year student in the ITEP program. And my question is actually for Darren. You touched on the political and how our education system in the U.S. is really controlled by politicians, and especially at the local level. What are your recommendations for how to fix this? Should we try to work the system that we have at the state level, or do you think that maybe, is this a role for the federal government?
Yeah. You know, I don't have a fully formed opinion on that question. What I do feel strongly about is that voices in politics are not representative yet of the communities that they're supposed to represent. And that's for a variety of reasons, without getting into anything beyond money in politics, gerrymandering, all that kind of stuff. And that goes across race, class, gender, sexual orientation. The avenues for people to run and get elected and be that voice in the political process is still very much limited, and so I think we need to fix that. Now, when it comes to education, you know, just the other day I was talking with my partner about you know, charter schools and you know, what are my opinions on that, and I've got a couple good friends who like started a charter school, but then I can also be critical of charter schools. I can be super supportive of funding, you know, public schools and really investing in that in the community, but you know, also I myself never went to a public school, so there's a little bit of like an inauthenticity sometimes when I speak from that, because I went to private schools my whole life. So I'm still very much kind of don't have a fully formed opinion, but it's a conversation that I'm always involved in. So yeah, I think I'll kind of leave it at that. Basically, I'm not the one who I'm not in a position to answer that question. I think that there are communities whose voices and perspectives aren't fully heard when those types of decisions are being made. And I think those are the voices that need to make some of those decisions. And I'll be an observer, viewer on the outside.
Thank you all for being here tonight. It's so interesting to hear all your perspectives, and I was thinking as all of you were speaking that we all think of race as this macro thing that occurs in societies, which it does, but in your conversations and your comments, it's clearly a micro thing. It really happens in our interactions with people, and perhaps that's what we need to focus in more, is how in these micro interactions in classrooms especially, which is a big theme in the comments, how do we become better equipped to have uncomfortable conversations about race, so that in these micro moments, race maybe doesn't hurt as much, or doesn't bother us as much, right? It becomes something we can work through as opposed to work against us. And I guess I'm thinking about classrooms, how the teacher's role is really critical in that. And I'm so glad to see teachers or people who are in K-12 here. I was a high school teacher, and so I definitely think a lot about the ways that teachers are improvising a lot around these kind of things that come up, and sometimes they really screw it up, you know, and I'm aware of that too. So I guess that my question would be to any of the panelists, but I think a couple of you brought up this very clearly. In classrooms, what are the ways that teachers, as moderators of conversation or as facilitators of conversation, can do a better job of working through race, facilitating conversations about race? Because I guess what I'm hearing today is that schools are going to be a place where they're going to be studying a lot of different topics, but race is going to always sort of come through, right? It's going to always be an issue depending on whether we have a majority or minority sort of issue going on. That's going to be a constant. So I'm trying to think about how can we train teachers or educators at the K-12 at the higher ed level to manage these things better. And I think AU does really want this. Just to your point, Louise, I think AU has a really great diversity, and now the question is how do we create a more inclusive atmosphere? So to any of the panelists, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
You can both go.
So this is the limited anthropology knowledge I have, but something called social capital and trust. So, you know, as a teacher, I've only done tutoring, so I'm not going to speak as a teacher, but as a student, what I would say is when a teacher builds trust with me, I can understand them. I'll listen more clearly. But also, as a teacher, I think being in situations, I was in public school all my life, very bad schools. We were more worried about what was going on outside of school than what was going on in school. But if as a teacher you're able to build that social capital that gives you the license to speak not from a place of privilege, but from a place of understanding the situation. One of my biggest concerns when I was going to high school specifically was that I grew up in a low-income neighborhood where most of us, had a rough life, but our teachers didn't. So that always caught a nerve with me, which is you drive 30 minutes to this low-income school because you want to, be a teacher, right? But yet you've never been here after 5. So you don't know what happens between 6 and 8 a.m. So you don't understand why we come to school hungry. You don't understand why we have PTSD. But if you build that social capital with the neighborhood, with the school, and with your students, they'll listen to you and they'll respect you.
I think I was rushing through some of this earlier. I think there are lots of ways in which, when I was talking about structural competency earlier, part of what I was trying to respond to is a movement within education over the years. People have talked about, culture relevant pedagogy is a different issue. That's not what I'm being critical of here. But there is a sense that if we, that culture is a kind of a flat thing, and if we know what culture our kids come from, then we know you can kind of read them. But what that doesn't get at all is any kind of, as we were talking about earlier, some of the larger kind of power dynamics that play out in our schools. All the stuff that Luis is talking about, there's so many levels at which we need to have authentic engagement with the kids in our classrooms and with their lives. And one of the key roles that we play as instructors is not just in helping facilitate conversations about race and difference and helping kids to understand that, in fact, recognizing and appreciating difference is where we need to be, not trying to pretend like we don't see it, but also our role in sorting and ranking students. Are we having high expectations of all our kids? Are we having high expectations and helping them meet those expectations? Are we creating a context in which they have a sense of belonging in the schools that they're in? Do they know that we believe that they can achieve high levels, right? All those kinds of things are as important as being willing to have, concrete conversation, especially, if we're teaching math. There's lots of ways in which I hear from math and science teachers sometimes, this conversation about diversity is irrelevant to me. And of course it's relevant. It's even more relevant. The question is, what kind of exams are you giving? Are you helping kids to have an opportunity to navigate and become successful, all those kind of things. So I think it should be on the agenda for all of us to think about, issues of access and issues of equity, and issues of inclusion, and to think about our roles as educators and what impact we want to be having, and then what impact we're actually having.
So to answer your, to go on kind of how to have these conversations, I think there's a couple of just dialogue principles that are important for students and teachers to think about when engaging in these types of conversations. One comes with structure. I think how a classroom is set up communicates a lot to students, and we consciously or subconsciously orient ourselves based off of our communities. We segregate ourselves, and how we set up a classroom can allow that to play out in potentially negative ways. So for me, a circle is a very it's a structure for a classroom that represents equality in many ways. So I think that's one thing I think that can break down some of those barriers. Then I think some of the principles are, having a conversation that has a center instead of sides. And too often I believe we can have conversations where even the teacher is trying to convince students to think a particular way. And what that means is to have a particular side on the issue. But when we're structured in a circle, we understand what we're talking about and trying to understand it from the center of the circle as opposed to which side of the circle is the right one. That shifts our demeanor, it shifts our tone, it shifts the kinds of questions that we ask just by having that in our heads. A conversation with the center, not with sides. Third thing I'll say is, speaking from the heart and personal experience, as opposed to theoretical abstract ideas or falling into the trap of speaking on behalf of your entire race. I think oftentimes, yeah, you feel uncomfortable or put off when someone says like, well, as a black man, like, how do you think so-and-so? But I'll be honest, sometimes that can be flattering. You know, sometimes you get a certain amount of attention from it. And so I think, yeah, sometimes I don't want to be in that role. Other times I'm fine with it. But I think we can just eliminate all the potential pitfalls of that if we have a conversation around some of these serious issues where we say, speak from your heart. Speak with I statements. Not, well, we and, you know, they say, and I've heard some people say, speak from personal experience, because then we recognize how we are as individuals, and maybe that uncovers something as a community and as a whole. And then the last thing I'll say is the power of suspension. We all have opinions, we all have beliefs, we all have perspectives. I'm not asking anyone to get rid of them. They're based off of what's happened to us in the world. So we have a right to hold on to these, we have a right to express them. But we can express our opinions, our beliefs, and our perspectives not as weapons to defeat somebody else's opinion or perspective. We can say, yes, I have this sword, but I'm not going to use it to lash out at you, who also has a sword. I'm going to take my sword, I'm going to lay it down in the middle of the circle so you can explore it as I can explore yours, but we're not going to use them in a combative way. And I think this idea of suspension, very difficult to do, because I think in many ways we're trained to use our opinions and perspectives as weapons to defeat somebody else's and delegitimize somebody else's. It doesn't have to be that way. So I think with those principles in mind, it really helps us navigate in very effective and very beautiful and powerful ways those tough but important conversations.
Thank you. I see one hand here and one at the back, and I think we actually have time for just about 2 more questions, so that's perfect. Let's see. You're at the back, JD, so could you please pass the mic to Kwame, and I'll pass to Mahogany up here.
Good evening. Kwame, first year as a student. Thank you, panel, really my question is driven from Dr. Silva's talk about racial quotas in university. I wonder how students grapple with the fact that, okay, I'm thinking of South Africa now, because they also implemented that in their universities in history. And it created a middle class, a black middle class that became further removed from their own communities. So I wonder what's your thoughts on that? What needs to be done so that when we do put these quotas in place to address the racial inequalities, that we don't form other kind of equalities? What needs to be done there? And then my second question is, in a society, like Joey said, where race is seen as something that's not an issue, how do you cause people to see that issue when there are so many other issues that, and I guess this is for the entire panel, when in the society there are so many other issues that are going on and new ones that are coming to the forefront because of maybe the US is trying to change policies in that place, or there's just so much going on to then bring up race, which is seen as a non-issue. How do you then bring that to the forefront as well?
Well, thank you for those great questions. I actually know a little bit about South Africa because I did a dissertation comparing Brazil and South Africa. But in relation to your question about affirmative action, I think one thing to keep in mind, especially for quotas for universities, that this is a very small policy. So in that sense, it's not going to solve everything, and it's not its goal to solve everything. So really to judge the success or failure of affirmative action, as some people have done, I think, in South Africa, to say it has not solved all the inequality problems, it's really unfair, because that's not the goal of the policy. The goal of the policy is really to bring diversity to higher education. So in that sense, I think it's been really successful in South Africa. It's true that it has created a lot of other problems, and my sense in South Africa is that the whole PE and this historical silence about class has created a lot of problems also. And now I think that there is also, and I think that's actually a dangerous thing, we can talk about it afterwards if you want, there is a really strong strategy in South Africa to silence debates about race. And I think this is a bit surprising. There's been a recent article actually in 2015 on the American Sociological Review, which is a person analyzing how teachers in South Africa are dealing with the history of apartheid. And basically they are saying that they are telling both sides of story, which means that they have to understand how black suffers, but also how white suffers. And I first thought that might be an interesting idea. Say, okay, we're not going to just say that, like, put guilt, that the justification of teachers that they don't want white students to feel guilty. But then you say, really, like, was it really as bad for whites? I think, like, is it really both sides of the story? So I think there is an issue in South Africa where it's like, okay, it's not, and then I jump to the second question. It's true that it's not only about race anymore, but it is still about race. And I think a lot of times when people are thinking in South Africa and in Brazil that it's not about race, they are thinking that it's not about race as it is in the US. But it is about race because race is part of the structure in those two countries. Those two countries were really historically constructed around race. So it is differently about race, but somehow it is still about race. That would be my general answer. But we can talk about it, more about it later.
Thank you. We did have one more question quickly, and then after that we'll invite you to the reception.
Hi, as a master's candidate in bilingual education, I wanted to bring in language, of course. In our classes with the lovely Miss Dr. Kalise, we talk about language and culture and identity all the time. And so I'd like to know, I know Jody mentioned it, I think Louise mentioned as well, you know, like that language is a part of our identity. You mentioned that, you know, mother tongue wasn't allowed to be used at first, and you just mentioned that it was, you know, a strong part of you. So how would, you know, race in the classroom is important for, you know, teachers need to be aware of and how to navigate around that. But how do you navigate around the different languages in the classroom and multilingualism and, you know, because that can also be the reason for certain issues that teachers have in the classroom when it comes to behavior. You know, they think that a student is misbehaving, but, or maybe they don't want to participate, but really they just don't understand what they're saying, or they don't feel confident enough or comfortable. They feel like they're in that uncomfortable space. So what would be your, I guess, suggestions for teachers in the classroom dealing with multilingualism?
So before I pass the mic, let me see if I'm framing this right. Your question is about language as part of this sort of bigger package of race and culture as one of the things that affects students' experiences in the classroom and where teacher misunderstandings can really impact them?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm assuming you wanted to answer.
I was just passing it. Okay. This is very interesting for me just because I came from being in a school where when I used the mother tongue, well, when I used or Creole, you know, I would be side-eyed or eyes were rolled. But also at home, I was actually not allowed to speak patois to my mother until I was an adult because it was expected that I needed to grasp the English language properly enough before I could start talking to adults in that way. So it was also reinforced at home. And that was a little troublesome because even in university, it stayed with me. And there are people in this room who have asked me to speak Jamaican, and I cringe because when I'm asked to do it, I remember it's because I've been socialized in a way where I think it's a bad thing, even though it's what makes me, in a way, quintessentially Jamaican, it's something that I find very hard to do. But when I was in Japan, I actually, in the classroom, because there were so many different students in my class, I was lucky enough in Japan to have students from Korea, China, Japan, the Philippines, and so there were students who were using all sorts of languages for several reasons in the class, whether it was rebelling or just because it was comfortable for them. And so for me, and it was a rule that I was actually not supposed to use for the individuals who are in here that have been on the JET program, that we were never supposed to use Japanese in our classes. Because we were there for English speaking, we were never supposed to use Japanese. But I quickly realized that Japanese was the equalizer in that class. And so for me, when I was managing classrooms, because Japanese was the equalizer in that class, at times when people were making fun of students of other races, just being able to express that, hey, no, this is a different side of the point, but in being able to speak Japanese to all students, to kind of bring them to that central point, was something that I used to ensure that students felt like they belonged in that class. So even though there were multiple nationalities, that being able to use the foreign language that was not my native language to be able to kind of bring them together was something that I utilized a lot.
Okay. Thank you all so much. We really appreciate your attendance. Thank you again to our panelists for really stimulating.